Good afternoon, everyone. I will call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 140 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics.
To go here, or okay, good. Avant de commencer, j'aimerais.
Before we begin, I would ask all in-person participants to read the guidelines written on the updated cards that you will find on the table. These measures are in place to help prevent audio and feedback incidents and to protect the health and safety of all participants, including the interpreters. You will also notice a QR code on the card which links to a short awareness video.
Okay. Conformément.
Pursuant to Standing Order 1083H and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, October 29, 2024, the committee is commencing its study of privacy breaches at the Canada Revenue Agency. I would like to welcome our witnesses for the first hour today. Appearing today, we have the Honorable Marie-Claude Bibeau, Minister of National Revenue, and by her side, we have from the Canada Revenue Agency, Bob Hamilton, who is the Commissioner of Revenue. Minister, you have up to 5 minutes for your opening remarks. And go ahead, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about the Canada Revenue Agency's work regarding unauthorized access to taxpayer information. First and foremost, it's absolutely essential to mention that protecting taxpayer information remains one of the highest priorities for the Government of Canada and the agency. We have zero tolerance for fraud in all of its forms. Allow me to use this introduction to paint you a picture of the situation. Unfortunately, the increase in fraud and identity theft is a global trend. All government institutions and private sector organizations around the world face these constant and persistent threats. No organization is immune to this phenomenon, and not even the Government of Canada institutions such as the agency. In fact, the Canadian Anti-Fraud Centre continues to warn Canadians about these ongoing threats. Within the agency, since 2020, there has been a significant increase of identity theft cases and unauthorized use of third-party taxpayer information following the announcement of COVID-19 emergency benefits. Later that year, the agency also saw a marked increase in external data breaches and cyber threats. And I would like to reassure everyone that the agency has implemented a multi-layered security approach. First, the agency regularly monitors taxpayer accounts for suspicious activity in order to identify, prevent, and quickly address potential fraud and identity theft. The agency has also implemented many tangible measures to make its systems more robust. For instance, the multi-factor authentication, the revocation of high-risk identifiers, the requirement to have an email registered in the agency's My Account, and the use of the CAPTCHA application, which ensures that the agency is dealing with a human and not a robot, and increased penetration testing of its computer systems. To combat fraud, the agency also combines advanced data and analytics with intelligence gathered from a variety of sources, including law enforcement and financial institutions. In addition, the agency continues to collaborate with domestic and international partners to inform its strategy and prevent these violations from continuing. To this end, the agency maintains regular communication with the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada on various subjects. These communications include privacy breach management, privacy investigations, and new or amended initiatives that involve the use of personal information.
The agency is a member of the Joint Chiefs of Global Tax Enforcement known as the J5. This organization brings together 5 countries, including Canada, which conduct coordinated operations to apprehend fraudsters who commit cross-border tax crimes. In addition, the agency has dedicated teams to address issues related to fraud, whether it be privacy breaches, identity thefts, or tax schemes of all kinds. In recent years, the agency has also increased the resources dedicated for combating fraud of all kinds. Finally, I can assure you that the agency continues to invest tirelessly in security while improving its technologies, processes, and controls. I'll conclude by telling you that the Government of Canada and the agency take the fairness and integrity of Canada's tax system very seriously. Canada's self-assessment system is based on the trust of individuals and businesses in the agency. Everyone here is doing everything in their power to keep that trust at a high level. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you, Minister. And just for the benefit of other committee members, I've asked Mr. Hamilton to make his declaration in the second hour so that we can maximize the time that we have with the Minister. And Minister and Mr. Hamilton, as you know, members have short periods of time to ask questions. Please don't take any offense if they want to reclaim their time and ask another question. Mr. Chambers for 6 minutes. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Bienvenue, Ministre. Thank you for coming. I believe it's our first time at committee together. When were you first made aware of the privacy breach that was reported in the CBC just a couple weeks ago?
Okay. Well, as you know, I can't speak of any specific occurrence. Mais ce que je peux vous dire, c'est que, bon,
But what I can say is that as soon as I got to the agency in July last year, I had a comprehensive briefing on all potential fraud cases and the cases that were under investigation at the time. And every time after that point onwards, every time there was a somewhat important investigation, I was informed of the situation.
You were informed of fraud when you arrived at the CRA, when you received your first briefing, is that correct?
I had a general briefing on the different possibilities and on the past history.
But as it relates to the specific privacy breach that was reported with connection with H&R Block, when were you made aware of that case or those cases?
Vous savez,
Well, I'm sure that you know full well, Mr. Chambers, because of the Section 241 on the Income Tax Act. I cannot talk about specific cases.
Minister, I'm very familiar with Section 241. You're not talking about an in particular taxpayer at the moment. We're asking for when were you made aware? There is a briefing note, a memo, that has the sentence in it. Consensus is that gaps pose major risk to the agencies. Where there are internal funding, human resource considerations, all agree that visibility is needed. Do you recall receiving that memo?
je reçois plusieurs mémos. Je suis briefée de différents.
I receive many memos, and I'm verbally briefed and in writing in different ways, so that doesn't surprise me.
To shed some light. This memo, do you recall the memo that I'm referring to? This was reported in the CBC?
No, I do not.
No, you do not. Okay.
No, I do not. And I would just echo what the minister said. That
I have
we
very
don't
limited time, Commissioner. I
talk about
appreciate it.
specific cases.
So, Minister, your testimony is that you cannot tell Canadians when you learned of a serious privacy breach that was reported in the news.
Je suis informée.
I am rapidly informed when the agency identifies a potential fraud case.
Be fair to say, if you're rapidly informed when the breach occurred, you likely would have been informed shortly thereafter, correct?
Absolument. Quand il y a une breach.
Absolutely. When there's a breach, a significant breach, I am quickly informed.
So why was that breach not reported to the public as a material breach when you learned of it shortly after it occurred?
Alors, la façon dont on fonctionne à l'agence.
Well, the way they work at the agency is that as soon as there's doubt there's identity theft, first off, they block the account and we communicate with the individual or the individuals or the company that is concerned. So we inform that person directly. So it's only in cases where there is something that's more generalized, for instance, during COVID, we would go ahead with an at-large communication, but it's usually the person and the person's concerns. They were immediately informed.
Thousands of taxpayers affected. If this breach occurred outside of government, there are obligations for those organizations to publicly inform or inform the public. Why is it that this breach was not publicized, but worse, withheld from the Privacy Commissioner until after the deadline passed for him to include it in his report in 2024?
Je peux vous dire que déjà dans le...
Well, I can tell you that in the general report of the auditor for 2022, we had already started revealing or transferring this information, providing this information, because yes, today you're talking to me about a block of 31,000 identity theft cases, but this has happened across multiple years, many years. And if you go back to the Auditor General's report from 2022, you would see that there are already 23,000 cases that have been made public.
If the process at CRA works really well in that the minister is informed relatively shortly after you're made aware of privacy breaches that happened over multiple years, it's reasonable to assume that you or your predecessor were made aware of these privacy breaches well before the March deadline that the Privacy Commissioner needs in order to include these privacy breaches in their annual report to Parliament. Why was it that these privacy breaches were reported to the Privacy Commissioner after the deadline when your own testimony suggests that you would have been made aware of these privacy breaches well before the deadline to report these to the public?
Donc, moi, je suis informée rapidement.
Well, I'm quickly informed when there are attempts at identity theft, and then we need to validate. And to do that, we inform the individual or the individuals quickly, and then we report the situation. And as I said, we had already started reporting the situation in the AG report from 2022.
There have been very few breaches at the CRA because he was not made aware of them to include in his report in 2024. So the timeline just doesn't quite work for me at this moment, but I believe I've expired my time.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chambers. Next, we're going to go to our friend from Chateauguay-Lacolle. Ms. Shanahan, you have 6 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Chateauguay-Lacolle.
Thank you, Chair. Chateauguay-Lacolle, but soon the name of the circumscription is going to change. Minister, thank you for being here with us today. And for people who might not know, I worked for a long while in this field in terms of preparing taxes, and of course, it's very important for Canadians to be well informed and supported in their tax declarations, tax returns rather. And when I started, everything was in paper. Maybe Rene also remembers those days. We would have our two papers, one for Quebec, one for Canada, and we would fill out both returns, and then we would harmonize the two. But in the meantime, of course, software has now become available, and data is now automatically available, and you go onto a website and you can access your confidential information to verify things. So I try to let people know as much as I can. While those sources are for you to verify things, because there can always be issues and mistakes. Minister, what do you think is the best way for Canadians to make sure that their tax returns are done in the correct manner? Well, thank you, Ms. Shanahan. There is a lot of communication coming out of the agency on that, but the first recommendation will be to make sure that you're not using always the same username and password, because that makes you extremely vulnerable when you have very easy to guess passwords. If a scammer gains access to one of your passwords, then and be it at your bank or the password you use for the agency or other passwords, that's the first thing. And At the agency, we have a whole communication strategy on our website, and we provide information in other ways as well. We have education tools available to people so that they can protect themselves. I think we might call that financial hygiene or literacy. That's extremely important because as we speak, identity theft is a big issue. And almost all of these identity theft situations occur outside the agency. And it might be hard to remember this every single time, but it's usually people who have found people's username and password outside the agency somewhere, and that's how they get into the agency systems. Well, thank you for providing this information. And you referred to these cases of identity theft. And last year, I was at the Public Accounts Committee when we had witnesses appearing, and I think Mr. Hamilton also appeared at the time. And it was the AG, the Auditor General, who had done some analysis and shared the results with the public. We were talking about 20,000 cases or so. And we need to also be careful about the timing because tax returns are filled out 3 or 4 months after the fiscal year ends, because we have from January 1st to 31st of December, that's the fiscal year. And then people, taxpayers, have a certain period of preparing their tax returns. And then it might also take some additional time, sometime after that, for the agency to detect some situations. So I'd like to hear you on that too. But I want to underline one more thing. According to the Auditor General, the measures taken by the agency at the time were satisfactory. So do you think the same way? Today, are you satisfied with the measures taken by the agency? The agency has introduced many systems to protect taxpayers. We are partnering with many institutions in Canada, but also internationally. So when there is an incident, we immediately share information amongst ourselves, and we share techniques to prevent similar occurrences. And we add additional layers of safety, because if one layer fails, then there's another layer beneath that to catch that situation. So we have multi-factor authentication, and every single time you change information in your My account, it might be your address, it might be your banking information especially, you immediately receive an email. So if you receive an email saying, well, your banking information has been changed in your My account, and if you haven't done that, you have to call immediately the hotline so that your account can be blocked. So we have introduced many security measures to prevent these situations, but scammers are creative, but we need to also be creative, and we have a team that's keeping a close eye on that to make sure that we're protecting people with the new strategy. Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Ms. Shanahan. And next up, we have Mr. Villemure for 6 minutes. Go ahead, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Minister, thank you for being with us today. Well, I have many questions for you, but you said and that, well, it's often the user's responsibility to change their password, etc. But digital platforms and systems can be complicated, and here we're talking about trust in an agency such as the CRA. And today, I think we have come across a problem in the reasoning, in the logic of things. I mean, is there not a way of taking the burden off the shoulders of the users? Well, I think it's shared responsibility. We need to make sure, for instance, when we're driving, we have to put on our seat belts. So everyone has an individual role and responsibility to play. But of course, we are deploying a lot of effort, spending a lot of energy and resources at the agency to prevent these cases of identity theft. And in this recent case, the information was obtained outside the agency's systems. So that's how scammers were able to gain access. So the agency has, again, introduced many measures. For instance, you may have experienced this yourselves. You go into My Account, and then you're asked to click on the square where there's an image of bicycle, for instance. That is just to make sure that there's a human and not a machine on the other end. Or you, for instance, receive a code on your cell phone. Well, how many employees are there at the agency? Well, about 60,000. Well, in the 60,000, how many people are supervising at the first level? I would turn to the Commissioner to answer that question. I don't know the exact number, but supervisors at the first level, I will need to go back and when you say at the first level, maybe about 400 executives, but there's another layer of employees, but I'll find you the number. Well, I would also like to know the following. With whistleblowers, there's usually a reaction that comes up. And what do you think about what has happened with the whistleblowing situation? Well, I believe that some situations need to be shared with the public via whistleblowers. That is why we support the legislation on that. But the agency, of course, is a prime target, and there's a lot of personal information stored at the agency, and we are governed by the Income Tax Act, especially Section 241. So there are a lot of measures. There's a code of ethics, and we have to be mindful, and every employee is responsible for protecting the integrity of the fiscal system. And clearly, we must not compromise investigations. But in this group of 60,000 employees, how many are working from home or working remotely? As we speak, we have a rule that says they need to be in the office 3 days a week. But there are some employees who have exemptions, but the general rule is that they need to be in the office 3 days a week. But there are others who have to work from the office 5 days per week because of the positions they hold. Well, has a majority of these employees been hired since the pandemic? Well, before the pandemic, we had 43,000 employees. At the height of the pandemic, we had 62,000, and today we have about 50,000 employees. So some employees maybe have not even known the agency before the pandemic. So there's a company culture, there's an institutional culture, right? That's the case everywhere. So remote work might have an impact on adopting this culture at the agency. So I just want to know if there has been sufficient supervision, given that some employees were never at the place of work. Well, when you say supervision, at what level? Because we have found ways, different ways of working, especially during COVID. And I can reassure you that there are mechanisms in place to make sure that we are protecting the integrity. Of course, employees have very specific levels of access. But whistleblowers seem to think that nothing has been done on this case. Well, we have more than 60,000 employees, and not everyone is aware of all the work that the different teams and security teams and the others they liaise with are doing to improve the system. And I have a bit of an issue with the use of the term whistleblower in this situation, because the information that's been publicly shared with media outlets was already public information in different reports from the AG, or it was contained within the testimony before the Finance Committee or the Public Accounts Committee. So we did not learn anything new in the newspapers. So this information was available to parliamentarians and others. Well, I will ask additional questions in the next round. Thank you, Mr. Villemure.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Minister, I have to state right off the top, I found your responses to Mr. Chambers highly evasive. So I'm going to give you the opportunity to reply on the Nixon test. I'm going to start with just an agreed statement of facts that you've raised. You stated that the AG reported in 2022 that 23,000 accounts had been breached. Is that correct?
Yes.
You took office in 2023. Is that correct? You became a minister of this
Yes.
in 2023?
Yes.
And in that transition, you would have been updated on the breaches in 2022, correct?
Yes.
And you would have been aware that some $190 million in scams and due to hacking came from losses that went as far back in 2020. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Reasonable.
So we now know that in July, 31,000 accounts have been breached, correct?
Yeah, it's reasonable to, yeah.
Okay. So in that space, at what time did you know that the 31,000 accounts had been breached? Was that back in July of 2024?
I can't be that specific.
Why?
I can tell you, because I don't recall every briefing I've got
This
in
is
the
a
last
significant
year.
breach. Like,
I know, but you're asking me specific numbers.
Minister, we're talking about a material breach of thousands of people, hundreds of millions of dollars in your department. Mr. Hamilton, I'll put to you the Nixon test. At what point in time did you know these breaches happened?
I'm kept regularly.
Eh bien, on m'informe régulièrement des atteintes qui ont lieu. J'aimerais connaître la date, s'il vous plaît, monsieur. Je n'ai pas la date. Malheureusement, je ne l'ai pas en tête comme ça. Vous ne connaissez pas la date, mais vous saviez que vous alliez venir comparaître au comité? Oui. Alors, vous vous êtes préparé comment? Eh bien, je me suis assurée de savoir quelles actions ont été prises et la date. Alors, écoutez, bon, monsieur le président, j'aimerais quand même souligner que le commissaire sur son bureau a un document, une note de briefage. Et, Madame la ministre, j'imagine que vous savez que ces 5 dernières semaines, il y a eu de l'obstruction qui porte justement sur des documents. Et je le dis pourquoi? Parce que je ne veux pas demander à ce comité de déposer une motion, de demander les documents que vous avez sous les yeux. Ce que je veux que vous fassiez, c'est que vous répondiez à mes questions clairement, parce que moi, j'ai du mal à comprendre que vous soyez présenté à ce comité sans avoir les dates liées aux atteintes. Bon, est-ce que je pourrais essayer de répondre à votre question? Oui, allez-y. Bon, déjà, il faut faire la différence entre 2 périodes. Il y avait la pandémie et ensuite l'après-pandémie. Beaucoup d'atteintes ont eu lieu lors de la pandémie. Je pense que vous avez parlé des 23 000. Malheureusement, le temps passe, dit le député. Donc, alors, quand est-ce que ça devient assez important que là, eh bien, vous estimez que vous avez le devoir d'informer les Canadiens de ce genre d'atteinte au sein de votre ministère? Eh bien, il y a eu une conférence de presse pendant la pandémie. Non, là, sous l'administration de 7 ministres. Eh bien, nous avons fait rapport de manière transparente au commissaire à la vie privée. Je sais que, Monsieur Hamilton, j'ai l'impression qu'on a là une culture du secret. Est-ce que vous pourriez nous parler de la politique de votre ministère sur les lanceurs d'alerte, s'il vous plaît? Oui, bien sûr, et je peux vous dire que notre politique sur les lanceurs d'alerte, c'est que nous encourageons les gens à parler à leur superviseur s'ils remarquent quelque chose. Nous avons aussi un processus à l'interne anonyme pour tout employé qui pourrait donc signaler une chose qui lui paraît étrange. Et nous avons aussi le commissaire de l'intégrité publique que vous pouvez contacter. Alors, vous avez envoyé un courriel sur justement le maintien de l'intégrité. Lorsque l'on parle du lanceur d'alerte sur ces divulgations publiques, eh bien, on parle d'éventuelles mauvaises pratiques au sein de votre lieu de travail pour le bien public. Mais là, ce n'est pas ce que vous nous avez décrit. Alors, j'aimerais vous dire 2 choses. Premièrement, nous avons des processus à l'interne qui sont bons pour ces lancements d'alerte. Et les employés ont aussi la responsabilité de ne pas parler, de ne pas divulguer les renseignements des contribuables. Oui, mais là, on ne parle pas de renseignements. Là, on parle d'une atteinte immense à la vie privée des Canadiens de tous les jours. Et d'ailleurs, vous savez, moi, j'aide des milliers de personnes à faire leur déclaration fiscale. Et on a parfois des aînés qui, du jour au lendemain, ne peuvent pas recevoir leur sécurité de la vieillesse, par exemple, et autres. Donc, encore une fois, je vais vous poser la question. Je vous demande, s'il vous plaît, d'y répondre de manière transparente. Quel est le montant total des pertes publiques qui ont découlé des comptes, que ce soit des comptes qui ont été hackés ou non? Le montant total perdu. Je n'ai pas ce chiffre, dit le commissaire. Il y a des fonctionnaires qui vont comparaître lors de la deuxième heure qui pourront peut-être vous répondre. Sur les lanceurs d'alerte, j'aimerais vous dire aussi que oui, vous pouvez donner des renseignements sur les contribuables, mais on ne parle pas de manière publique des stratagèmes parce qu'on ne veut pas que les gens s'en inspirent, que tout cela perdure. Donc nous avons une culture assez robuste justement qui porte sur ces signalements. Si vous voyez quelque chose qui cloche, il faut en parler. Rappel au règlement.
Problem with the English translation. I was just made aware of that, Mr. Green. So I'm just wondering, we can have a bit of a test here to determine. Okay. Okay. So ça termine notre premier tour. On va commencer le deuxième tour des questions.
So this is the end of our first round of questions. Second round of questions. We are going to start with Mr. Berthold for 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Bibo, hello. In your opening remarks, Minister, you used government language. It's a beautiful, well-prepared speech without many details about what happened and the extent of it. And unfortunately, you did not really dwell on the impacts for citizens, because we're talking about 31,000 breaches in 2020, 2021, and 62,000 taxpayers seem to have been impacted. Have you been able to take care of all of those files? Well, the first thing I can reassure you of is that as soon as we have doubt that the individual is immediately informed. Well, you've already said that, Minister, but of these cases, how many people are still waiting for their situations to be rectified? Have you been able to rectify all of these situations? Well, I would need to turn to my team on that, but there are different levels of breach. In some cases, the scammer, for instance, may have achieved, for instance, access, but without really penetrating deep. While in cases of fraud where money was paid out, where people are being investigated, and when they're under investigation, no additional transactions are possible. I have 2 cases before me. I cannot, of course, say the names, but there is a complaint received on the 28th of April, 2023, and it took it took 2 years for this individual's case to be rectified. I have another case before me, which was reported on 20th of May, 2020, and it was taken care of 8th of October, 2024. So, Minister, when you read articles like this, when you read information like this, are you not personally touched or are impacted by this? Of course I am, because each case is important. That much is clear, but there are different levels. But I'm talking about what you do, not what the agency does. When you see this, do you call the agency and tell them to take care of these situations quickly, or do you go, well, I'll wait and listen to the next briefing and we'll see, yes, this is not good, it's leaking into the media, so I'll go after the whistleblowers because this shouldn't be publicly available, this information. No, that's not what we do. But for people who are still waiting for their cases to be resolved, who are out of money, what do you have to say to them? Well, we have a big team working on this, and what I'm trying to tell you is that there are different levels of penetration or breach into the clients, into the individual's account. There are some cases that are quickly resolved. Some others are a bit more complicated and it takes more time. So we are here to help people, and we have protection systems that are in place. We are working with TransUnion to protect them too. Well, these cases should be resolved much more quickly because we're talking about people and families who don't have access to their money, who might not be able to buy food. So there are horrible numbers of people who are still waiting for a solution to their situation. And what we're hearing from you is that we're doing our best. There are different levels. Again, once again, government language. But Minister, you are responsible for the agency. Would you not want to shake things up a bit and tell them, hey, you have to resolve these cases in 2 months so that these people can carry on with their lives? Well, we can give you much more detailed examples, and you would see that we are trying to go as fast as possible, and it's not always dependent on what's available internally to the agency. There are some checks and controls that go beyond the agency, and we have to work in partnership with others when we don't have all the levers. Are there criminal complaints that have been filed to law enforcement services agencies in relation to these frauds? Is this a criminal organized network that we're looking at? Well, there are different types of attack that could be directed at the agency, but have there been complaints to law enforcement agencies? Well, we've had all kinds of cases, but how many law enforcement cases are there that are still pending or investigations that are going on? Well, this is on another file. I wouldn't be able to tell you how many investigations we have. Mr. Hamilton, would you be able to answer this question?
For sure, but what I can tell you is that when we look at these cases, and if we see there's a possibility of criminal activity, we have our own criminal investigators, and we can also refer them to the law enforcement authorities.
Combien ont été référés, Monsieur le Président? Peut-être que le ministre pourrait...
How many have been referred to law enforcement, though?
It's very clear. How many have you sent to the police?
Yeah, how many? I would have to consult with my team about exactly how many, and we may even have to get back to you on that. But we do have the ability to do that, and that also applies not just in fraudulent cases like this, but also in tax evasion cases where we might see criminal activity.
Thank you.
Oh,
Non, on n'a pas de temps pour cette round. Other 5 minutes online, go ahead.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président, et merci.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Minister, for appearing before the committee today. Before I begin with my questions for the Minister, I have a couple questions for Mr. Hamilton.
On the 31,000 cases that keeps getting cited, this was not just one breach. This was a series of different smaller breaches, correct?
Yes, that's right. It was of a similar type of breach in many cases, but yes, it was a bunch of breaches.
And these were third-party breaches, correct? These were not breaches of the CRA's own system. These were breaches of third-party systems linked to CRA, correct?
Yes, if you take a stylized example, it would be where somebody gets information from another third party outside, maybe a financial institution. That information is sold on the dark web or however, and then people use that information, that password or identifier, to try to break into the CRA system. And we saw instances of that during the pandemic when there was significant amounts of money at play. And actually that caused us to really ramp up our activities in the fraud space beyond what we had before the pandemic.
Thank you. I'm just trying to clarify things that have come up in some previous rounds to give you a chance to explain. There was a number of questions from Mr. Green about the timing of when you became aware of these breaches. And because there's a number of different breaches, you became aware of them, no doubt, at different times. So I'm not trying to ask for a specific date. Because I think that's where you were getting caught up. You were trying to think, did you hear about it on February 14th or February 27th or March? Can you remember around the period that you became aware of the different breaches?
Of all the way along, I would say there was a big event in about August of 2020 when we uncovered that there was a lot happening. And we saw some vectors coming in, so knew about that, and that was a big number. And then since then, we've seen some of those types, but we've also seen other types of cases where people have not necessarily come in and tried to get served money or what have you, but they're using the speed with which we give out refunds, et cetera, to try to create false returns and get refunds. So it's a different kind of a fraud, but we did see those coming up. And so that's a continuum. It doesn't happen all on one day. It happens as you go. And so I would honestly have to say I don't know the specific dates of when it went from 23 to 25 to something else, but perhaps some of my colleagues
because
do,
it was happening. No, but I understand. But I think it's just because it was happening over rolling periods because there were different breaches. So you don't have one specific date that you can just remember offhand because you were probably briefed a number of different times about breaches.
Yes.
Correct?
No, that's exactly right. And they continue where people are at least trying to attack us. I think we're getting better and better at resisting those. And I think the other thing that we pay a lot of attention to is when we know about it, we block the account, we take action, and then we pay attention to the individual. We try to resolve them as quickly as we can. I know earlier we talked about there are some delays. It's a big backlog coming out of the pandemic, and we spend a lot of our effort just trying to focus on protecting that individual's account, giving them credit protection where it's warranted, and then, you know, as we can work through it, solve the case and see exactly what happened and what needs to be done to remedy it. I'd like to be able to move even faster. We are moving faster now, but we are still dealing with many cases that came up in the early 2020s.
Thank you very much. Et Madame la Ministre, je connais que vous êtes quelqu'un qui a...
Minister, you're very hands-on. I know that, and that is not something new. When you assumed your role, you were briefed and you were told that there was an important situation going on, right? Well, you know me very well, Mr. Housefather, indeed, and if you'll allow me, I have the answer to the question by Mr. Berthold. 135 charges laid, 25 million in fines, and a total of 108 years of prison sentences and 44 millions of federal taxes. I don't have my glasses, but these would be the results of the past five years from 2019 to 2024. Thank you, Mr. Housefather. Mr. Chair, do I still have time? 3 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Housefather. Monsieur Villemure pour 2 minutes 30 secondes, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Villemure, for 2.5 minutes, please. Well, there seems to be a culture of secrecy at the agency rather than a culture of transparency. How many cases of snooping has there been? Well, in terms of attempts from employees, well, I can reassure you that that is surveilled very, very closely. There are mechanisms and systems that allow us to know if an employee is doing something of that sort. Even if you look at your own file, it's 5 days of suspension. It's really taken very seriously. I'm sure that's the case, but there's still 3,000 cases of that per year. Well, there is a scale of sanctions, and it might remain within our HR department, but we take it very seriously. But if last year I tell you that there were 3,000 such cases, does that surprise you? Well, I don't know. Well, whistleblowers, often they do it out of despair because supervision doesn't work. There's something else in the institution that doesn't work. Why do you think whistleblowers take action? Well, once again, I have a bit of an issue with the use of the term. Well, outside of our current context, because we've had similar cases before at the agency, why do they take action, in your opinion? Well, possibly because they think the organization could act in a different way. Well, in general, per year, how many whistleblowing cases do you have? Well, once again, what are you referring to? Well, whistleblowers who talk to media outlets or employees who talk to the Commissioner of Integrity or who communicate with the outside world? Well, I wouldn't be able to provide a specific answer. Would it be 100 or 1,000? I would be surprised if it's 1,000. Well, it's not the first time for the agency to be facing cases of breach or fraud. Well, I would like to provide some perspective. When we talk about fraud, identity theft, I'll give you some dollar amounts. We had a peak of identity theft during COVID because of the benefits and the programs that were introduced. So that was the worst year. Nothing else compares in 2021. But there has been fraud in the past. Yes, there has always been fraud. But last year, in terms of identity theft, we're looking at $3 million. But it was $59 billion. So $3 million, $59 billion.
Mr. Green, I'm going to give you an equal amount of time of 3 minutes on
Thank
this
you.
round because Mr. Villemure just had it. Go
I
ahead.
appreciate the equity, sir. Minister, are you currently investigating whistleblowers within the CRA?
On n'est pas en train de faire une...
We're not investigating our employees. We're just reminding our employees what their obligations are. And that is as per Section 241.
In a CBC story, you wouldn't deny the fact that you were going through the use of computers to see who is accessing what files and for what. Are you currently investigating whistleblowers within the CRA?
Can I talk, when you talk about whistleblowers,
People who presented information to the public.
In the public domain, we will always investigate if somebody does something inappropriate relative to our code of ethics or their duty of loyalty to us. So, for example, when we found that there were a bunch of employees that had claimed CERB,
Sure.
that was inappropriate.
Are you currently investigating the whistleblowers that resulted in the story with the Fifth Estate?
We are currently looking at all sorts of things that go on in the agency.
I'm asking you for a direct answer, sir. Could you please provide the committee with a direct answer one more time? Are you investigating the whistleblowers that resulted in the story of the Fifth Estate?
We are looking to determine how, if information was true and how it got into the public domain.
Will there be retribution, and if so, what will it be for the whistleblowers who went
I
wrong?
have no idea at this stage.
You have
we
no
don't know.
policies for this, sir?
We do have policies, but
What are the
I think as
policies?
was indicated, it can go from minor discipline, a verbal reprimand, a written one, all the way up to termination. So it depends on the severity of what happened, and we have strict policies about that. So when something bad happens, to have maybe take the CERB case again, there were people that were
Well,
fired.
we're talking with specificity of the Fifth Estate. So for the people who are watching, and particularly those who, for the public interest, shared information with the public, perhaps they felt that their loyalty was to the Canadian taxpayer to make sure they had the right information and not to a bureaucracy or a government per se. What do you say to those people who are watching here today?
I say we take very seriously our responsibility in that regard to be honest, truthful, and protect the Canadian public. But we also have to protect the information that's within the agency, because
Information or
my
embarrassment?
information, we can't allow
Information or embarrassment? Because it's not
information.
It's not disaggregated information. It's not like they're talking about my receipts. They're talking about a huge breach that resulted in 31,000 cases of fraud. So that's not material privacy breaches of individual files. That is a systematic and structural failure within the agency to figure out what was going on with these third parties. They obviously felt like it wasn't being addressed, so they went public. So that, to me, as an MP, quite frankly, I feel like we had a duty to know as well.
Okay, Mr.
We
Green.
also did not have the opportunity to know until we found out
Okay,
the
that's
media.
the 3 minutes. You'll have a chance,
Sorry
Mr.
about that,
Hamilton, in the second
I'll
hour.
let you answer when we come back on the next
I'm almost
round.
certain we're
I'll give you
probably
that.
going to revisit this. Mr. Chambers, you have 5 minutes, and then we're going to finish this off with Mr. Baines for 5. Go
Thank you,
ahead.
Mr. Chair. Minister, you testified earlier that you have zero tolerance for fraud in all its forms at the CRA. How much fraud, what's been the loss to taxpayers from all forms of fraud at the CRA, say, last year?
Last year, it's about 2 million, and this year, as of now, 3 million.
Sorry, fraud in all its forms?
In identity, dans les vols d'identité.
In identity theft.
For all types of fraud, GST carousel schemes, you said zero tolerance for fraud in all its forms. I'm asking for a number on how much fraud has been, perpetrated against the Canadian taxpayer.
Quand on dit qu'on a zéro tolérance,
when we say we have zero tolerance, it means we have a strong team and systems and tools.
Is that the testimony? You don't have a number?
À chaque fois qu'il y en a une, on...
Well, every single time there is a case, we hit back and we introduce all the measures so that those situations don't keep happening. That's what I mean when I say we have zero tolerance.
With respect to the identity fraud, just one more question on this matter. Since it was a significant number of instances, a sophisticated operation, no doubt, did you report this to the RCMP? Have they been engaged to, potentially consider links to organized crime, maybe an inside individual within the CRA that would be potentially aiding and abetting these kinds of schemes? Have you engaged the RCMP on the identity fraud cases?
Donc, le 31 000 cas dont on parle.
So the 31,000 cases that we keep referring to, there are multiple cases. There are groups of different situations in that. For instance, there is a denial of service attack, but there are also multiple individual attacks. So there are investigations that are going on, and we have an internal criminal investigations team that is also working on files. So there are different levels of investigations that are going on.
But your criminal investigations team is not the RCMP. So the question still remains, has any of these identity theft cases, especially those with respect to the third parties, breaches, have they been referred to the RCMP, or are you asking for help from the RCMP to help you?
Dans certains cas, certainement, parce...
In some cases, definitely, because as I was saying, in the last 5 years...
That's a yes? You have asked the RCMP for help?
Certainement, parce qu'on a des condamnations.
Sure, because charges have been laid. 135 charges have been laid in the last 5 years. So that means it comes from the police.
Breaches and the issue with the H&R Block, you have engaged the support of the RCMP?
Si vous voulez me référer à un...
Well, if you want to point me towards a specific...
In the next hour. These frauds often result in a debt owing to the government, a debt owing to the taxpayer. So with respect to the GST, very sophisticated GST carousel schemes, my question would be, what's the highest amount that the government has written off with respect to the GST carousel schemes?
Encore une fois,
Once again, if you want to, if you would like to point me towards a specific case, I will be able to answer. But what I can say about carousels is that we have many measures in place. I can talk about those.
Generally, what's the single largest amount to a corporate taxpayer that the CRA wrote off last year?
Je ne peux pas vous parler d'un cas en particulier.
I can't talk about a specific case.
Because of Section 241, is that correct? So would your position be that your predecessor and the CRA violated Section 241 when in 2019 they said that the highest amount of the amount that they wrote off in 2019 was $133 million? They actually were free to give the amount of the highest amount that a corporate taxpayer has written off. So, Minister, do you still want to rely on Section 241 privacy?
Regardez, je vais me tourner vers le commissaire.
I will turn to the committee.
Could it be 500 million, maybe 600 million? Like what's the amounts we're talking about here?
J'ai le processus sous les yeux, mais...
Well, I have the procedure before me, but I cannot give you the amount. Would you like to respond to that?
Sorry, I want to be very clear about this. Section 241 does not allow you to hide behind giving anonymized details. A previous minister in a previous CRA department released a number that said in 2019, $133 million was written off to one taxpayer. So my question is, how much was written off to the highest amount in last year?
So first, again, to repeat, I won't be able to answer that question
Okay.
because I don't know.
Okay.
But we are very public with our write-offs in the public accounts.
Okay.
And that's where some numbers, as much as we can reveal, is revealed there. So we can
Thank
go
you.
back and look at those, and maybe I can find the number that you're
Thank you,
looking
Mr.
for.
Hamilton.
And we
Thank
actually
you,
have some
Mr.
officials that may be
Chambers.
able to do that.
Mr. Baines, you have 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to the Minister and our officials for joining us today. Minister, in your opening remarks, you talked about the fact that there's an international effort to combat tax fraud. Can you give us some more details about this, please? And like what partnerships are there partnerships internationally that allow you to recollect funds that would have gone abroad?
Merci. Effectivement, on est...
Thank you. We are in different partnerships. We have the International Tax Administrators Forum, the chair of which is the Commissioner. We have the J5, which met in Ottawa about a month ago. And that group brings together public institutions, our counterparts from the 5 member countries, but also financial institutions, so it's public and private. We have the International Fiscal Convention Network, through which we can exchange specific information on specific files with multinationals, for instance. There's the International Bank Transfers Organization. We are exchanging information with around 100 countries in that group. And we also have many other tools at our disposal within Canada. So we're very active on the international scene to exchange information and to be able to trace people who are taking part in fiscal evasion.
Recollect the funds that have gone abroad that are fraudulently or lost.
On a des ententes avec certains.
We have agreements with some countries which allow us to share the information on such cases. While to what extent we're able to recover the funds, I don't have a concrete example. I don't know if the Commissioner can continue answering the question.
And we would have mechanisms in place, not just to share information, but if we have a dispute that arises about money that should have been paid in one jurisdiction and wasn't, or in another jurisdiction, we have methods of trying to resolve those. And we work very closely with other countries to have those mutual
And we're
agreement
successful in those?
procedures
Like
to
we
resolve
have successfully, so we have successfully recovered funds? Has that happened?
J'ai un exemple sous les yeux. Dans le cas des Panama.
Well, I have an example here. In the Panama Papers case, we were able to recover $83 million.
Okay, and maybe I want to just go back to what my colleague across the way was talking about. CRA, there's fraudsters pretending to be CRA agents, and it's difficult for CRA agents to ensure they're interacting with the right person, but similarly, it's difficult for taxpayers to ensure they're really in touch with the CRA agent. So, like, what are the best practices that you're recommending to taxpayers with respect to that? And should they always be those initiating the calls using a number on your website, or what is the mechanism in place for that?
Effectivement, il faut être très...
Indeed, people need to be very, very careful not to convey information if an agent of the agency calls them, because the agent will already have that information. They wouldn't be asking you for the information. And in case of doubt, whether a communication is from the agency, whether it's in writing or orally, people can always terminate that communication and call the general line of the agency. When you receive an email, there's usually a code as well. So if you call the agency with the code, and if the code doesn't match up to anything, then it's a case of fraud. But if it's the correct code, then in your communication with the agency, you can access your account. So someone calling you from the agency, they will give you information. They will not ask you for information.
Okay, what happens to taxpayers who are victims of identity theft? Are there measures to support them?
Oui, on travaille entre autres avec...
We work with TransUnion when there is a case of identity theft. It's similar to Equifax. People might be familiar with that organization. So It allows people to keep an eye on their accounts if they've had an identity theft case. It again depends on the level of the breach on the account. If the scammer has been able to change a bit of information, for instance, the banking information to receive the benefit payments without having access to the identity or other information of the taxpayer, that might be one case. In other cases, maybe the scammer has had access to everything. It's rare, but it can happen. So it depends on the level of penetration, and there's a matching level of support that is made available to protect people.
Thank you.
I have a question, Madam Minister. There were 31,468 privacy breaches between March 20th and December 22nd, or December 2023, which directly affected 62,000 Canadian taxpayers. Only 113 of those privacy breaches were reported to the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, and yet 31,468 were reported retroactively. Why weren't those numbers known at the time that only 113 were given to the Privacy Commissioner? Why wasn't he able to access that information?
Donc, c'est vrai qu'il y a eu
Well, it's true that there was a bit of a time elapsed between those two, but this information was available in the AG's report, and the delays explained by the extraordinary increase in identity theft situations. And what was done was block the accounts, contact the individual, just to make sure that if it was indeed a case of identity theft, because sometimes you are concerned that that might be the case, but it's the person themselves who has modified some information. So we have to validate, and that's our priority. And since the number was extraordinarily high, the team was focused on protecting and then following up. And then every single time there is a situation, we rush to understand what has happened and to fill in the gaps, as it were. So given the extremely high number, that is what explains the delay in reporting. But we report every trimester, and we appear here at the Public Accounts Committee, Finance Committee, so we always want to make that information available. But it was clear that there was a significant wave of such cases and that there was a delay because our priority was to protect people.
Be able to break down, and I'm not asking because I'm asking for the information. I just want to know, do we know of these 31,000 people who had their privacy affected? Do we know who they are, and have they been contacted individually or not?
Absolument.
Okay.
Absolument.
Absolutely. That is the first thing we do, block their account and call the individual. Thank you, Minister. We'll now switch to our second hour, and we will suspend briefly.
241. The committee is resuming its study of privacy breaches at the Canada Revenue Agency. Our witnesses are here for the second hour. From the agency, we've got Mr. Hamilton, who is the Commissioner of Revenue back, Sophie Galineau, Assistant Commissioner, Public Affairs Branch and Chief Privacy Officer Harry Gill is here, who is the Assistant Commissioner, Security Branch and Agency Security Officers, Gillian Prank. Is it Prank or Pranky? Prank? Pranky, thank you. Assistant Commissioner, Assessment, Benefit and Service Branch, and Marc Lemieux, who is the Assistant Commissioner, Collections and Verification Branch. Commissioner, I want to thank you for holding off on your statement. You've got up to 5 minutes to do it now. Go ahead, sir.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Merci for the opportunity to continue our discussion that we had. And as you've introduced the people already, but there are some people that can answer some of the more detailed questions that we talked about earlier. And I just want to say that the protection of taxpayer information remains one of our highest priorities. If you look at our mission in the agency, it's provide service to Canadians, fairness in the tax system through compliance, and protection of information. So we take it very seriously. In today's increasingly digital world, the rise in fraud and identity theft has become a global trend. So we're not the only jurisdiction or the only organization that's facing it. Internationally, responses to these trends include the Joint Chiefs of Global Tax Enforcement, J5, that the Minister mentioned, convening a special working group targeting cybercrime. The agency representing Canada is active member of the J5. Despite the rigorous security controls already in place, the agency, like any organization, recognizes that it's not immune to these growing trends and acknowledges that privacy breaches and identity thefts cause among the concern that these breaches cause among those affected. The agency does not publicly discuss tax schemes utilized by bad actors to avoid inspiring other would-be fraudsters to follow suit. Nevertheless, it's important to note that a privacy breach does not necessarily mean that our systems have been compromised or that information has been extracted. In the vast majority of cases that we encounter, fraudsters access data external to the agency, attempting to exploit it by posing as real taxpayers, which we discussed in the earlier session. That said, the agency has a multi-layered system of defenses to identify, protect, detect, and respond to threats like fraud, identity theft, and tax schemes. And we are successful in protecting hundreds of thousands of fraudulent attempts to gain personal and business taxpayer accounts. To support transparency, we report all material privacy breaches to the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat and the Office of Privacy Commissioner of Canada. Admittedly, as we discussed before, there have been some delays following the pandemic, but we do report them and consider ourselves to be very transparent in that regard. We also report on privacy breaches at the end of each fiscal year in our annual report to Parliament in the administration of the Privacy Act. Lorsqu'une fraude est soupçonnée, l'agence prend des mesures de
When fraud is suspected, the agency takes immediate precautionary measures on the taxpayer's account, such as locking it to prevent transactions and conducting in-depth reviews with the people impacted. Then our Identity Protection Services program takes over. The service is dedicated to both individuals and businesses, where we offer an accessible, high-touch service to the victims affected by identity theft. When appropriate, the agency also provides credit protection and monitors affected accounts to prevent taxpayers from being re-victimized.
Fraudulent funds are paid out. The agency takes every available enforcement action to return the funds to the Crown and hold the offending parties accountable. This includes criminal investigations in our own operation that could be referred also to the RCMP. Now, there is no silver bullet to protect against fraud or privacy breaches. That's why we have implemented these multi-layer safeguards, including multi-factor authentication as a mandatory measure. This requires persons to enter a one-time password every time they access the agency's login services. The agency also regularly performs security assessments such as vulnerability scanning, penetration testing, and security risk assessments of the agency's digital services and systems. We regularly conduct routine checks to identify taxpayer credentials that may have been obtained by unauthorized external parties, and we take immediate steps to revoke these IDs to prevent it from being exploited by fraudsters. De plus, nous investissons continuellement dans la sécurité.
Furthermore, we continually invest in security by improving our technologies, processes, and controls to ensure the security of taxpayer information. As fraudsters' tactics evolve, the agency adapts and remains vigilant in its efforts to stay one step ahead.
Would be pleased to answer any questions from the committee.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Hamilton. 6-minute rounds, starting with Mr. Chambers for 6. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for appearing at committee. Mr. Commissioner, just, you mentioned about there was some delays in reporting the privacy breaches. Just trying to get a handle on the decision rights framework within CRA. Like, whose decision would it have been to not report those breaches in the timely manner?
Mr. Chair, I guess I take responsibility for what happens within the CRA. It wasn't a conscious decision in the sense of, well, let's not report them. It was, we had a massive backlog. We were sorting out the process to report these privacy breaches because we hadn't had that number in the past. We had processes to first make sure we blocked the accounts to prevent the damage, inform the people, and then try to find out what went on. And then as time went by,
So the minister had no knowledge of this. So you're saying that the decision to not report was not a ministerial decision?
I'm sorry?
The decision to not report was not a ministerial decision?
Well, I guess I just take responsibility for it. It was a circumstance that we couldn't.
Here's the issue. For example,
workload.
Since we're on this issue about decision rights, whose decision was it to reverse the decision on Bear Trust? Was it a ministerial decision to reverse that decision, or was it a department decision to reverse the requirement to file for Bear Trust?
I'm trying to remember exactly how we came to that decision. But, I have some delegated authorities in that regard, and I'm sure I discussed it with the minister for sure.
Well, here's a former boss of mine said, you can always delegate responsibility, but not accountability. And it seems to me that there's a bit of murkiness around decision rights, veto rights, who makes a recommendation, and who ultimately decides. Because on one hand, if it's the department deciding on, as an example, Bear Trust, so the testimony is that the CRA can decide on its own not to implement a decision by the government or the finance department. It seems to me that there's a little bit of unclarity, or it's unclear about who actually is the final authority on some of these questions. So, I think we're going to poke a little bit more on that later, I hope. But with respect to these privacy breaches, the CRA says these are result of external breaches. There was no compromise to the CRA's systems as a result of these 31,000 cases. Is that?
Certainly the vast majority of cases arise from external threats. I don't think any of the 31,000 came from ours, but I'll ask my colleagues to that. And maybe just to your previous question, I derive my powers from the minister. She can delegate them to me, so I'm sure you know how that works. But I don't know, Mark, if you want to add to that.
For these identity theft cases that we were working on, we've been working on those cases since the summer of 2020, when they actually happened. And we've been contacting the taxpayers, making sure that we were talking to the right person and doing the inquiry to figure out what happened. And we took all the actions.
So I'm just going to cut in because I have a fair bit of time. The IRS has some fairly onerous protocols in place that would prevent, payments to people that live on like Tomato Street or what have you. Why is it that we seem to have taken this position? Have we not learned anything from COVID that the pay now, audit later function really hasn't worked out that well for taxpayers?
I think that what you're raising, I mean, is actually a very good question. And I can say from talking to my colleagues internationally, including the IRS, this is an issue that all tax jurisdictions are facing, that as we've moved into a more digital world, we can do things faster. But we also have to make sure, and that's good for service, but we also have to make sure that we have proper risk containment measures in place to be able to prevent bad things from happening. But you can't go to one extreme or the other. If we stopped everything and reviewed every transaction, then things would stop. But we also can't let them go through clearly. So I would argue that it's not clear to me that the IRS or anyone else has a better system
is
of
there
trying to strike that balance.
Is there an acceptable level of fraud that you think, you know, if you pay out, I don't know, insert a number, $100 billion of payments to Canadians or $60 billion, is there a level that you say, you know what, speed is important, so if it's like 1%, it's not a big deal?
Yeah, I don't have a number for that, but I mean, in a sense, in concept, that what you're saying is great. You have to be able to risk manage and think about what is an acceptable level so that you strike that balance.
So I have, in my remaining time, I have a few follow-up questions that are reasonably detailed with respect to like the memo from before. So we'll ask for that. I'll provide those to the clerk. So I hope we can, you know, maybe follow up in writing with some specific answers on what we've spoken about today. But just finally, why in 2019 would the department be totally fine with telling the public what's the largest single corporate tax write-off of $133 million, but today now try to hide behind the Section 241 with the largest corporate write-off?
Yeah, and maybe I will turn to my colleague, Mark Lemieux, for that. I don't have a particular memory of 2019.
Need a very quick response, please.
I was not there in 2019, so I can't respond to that question, but we got that question this year, and we validated, and we can't divulge that information.
Maybe you can circle back on that, Mr. Chambers, later, okay? Ms. Khalid for 6, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to our officials for being here today. I really appreciate it. I'll start with something that had come up in various questioning in the previous round with respect to the Privacy Commissioner and your interaction with the Privacy Commissioner. Obviously, we're dealing with significant amounts of data and privacy concerns for Canadians. Like, you have over 31 million clients, as you would call them, within the CRA, and 60,000 employees. What is your interaction like with the Privacy Commissioner? How often do you communicate with them, with their office, and what are the concerns that you raise with them?
Yeah, and I'll start there, but maybe my colleague Sophie can elaborate, because she's the one that has the closest relationship with that group. I would describe our relationship as quite good, just for the reasons you've described. We're a big organization, potential risks, and we're actually very open with them. Notwithstanding the delay that we talked about earlier of the 30,000, but we do endeavor to not only report to them completely and transparently, and we are all caught up on that backlog now, but we have regular interactions, and in some cases we will even give them an early heads up if we see something coming. So again, you'll hear from the Privacy Commissioner. He may have a different take on it, but I don't think so. But Sophie, I don't know if there's anything you'd want to highlight.
Perhaps just, thank you for the question. Just add that absolutely what the Commissioner just said is quite right. We do have a very good collaborative relationship with the Commissioner of Privacy, and we report, we're in full respect of regulations and obligations with regards to our reporting our obligations. Within 7 days of a material breach being confirmed, we are providing those privacy breach reports in, and we've been in discussion with them on this 31,000 workload. We were in close discussion with them to determine best ways to report them after they requested that from us in their February 2024 report. Again, we are now in compliance with that requirement.
Right. So this breach happened multiple years ago. How do you interact on a regular basis? I mean, is it just on an issue by issue basis, or do you have a regular framework as to how you communicate and work with the Privacy Commissioner's office?
So the expectation certainly is that if we, so I would say that it is on a case-by-case basis, and it's when, upon requirement. That said, when we do have cases that arise that we think are significant, even before we're able to confirm, we will give them a call to give them an early heads up. And certainly I've always found that the lines of communication there are very are well established and productive.
Thank you very much for that. I appreciate it. Commissioner Hamilton, you had earlier mentioned about a criminal investigations unit within the CRA. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Sure, and the criminal investigations unit would be involved in things like identity theft, potentially, and other fraud cases, but they also investigate tax evasion more generally. So we have our own set of investigators that can take on criminal cases, and as I mentioned, where appropriate, refer them to law enforcement and others. So that, we talked about the Panama Papers earlier, that would be a group that gets involved in that if there's a criminal activity and pushing forward on that. I don't know, Harry, if you want to add anything to that. Sure.
So I guess what I would add to that is our criminal investigations section within CRA investigates cases of tax fraud, GST fraud, legislation that we enforce. They are our link with the RCMP. So the question came up earlier about the RCMP. Our first step is to refer it to them. At that point, they do their internal processes and they will make the decision whether it goes to the RCMP. Those details are very guarded for obvious reasons, as you would understand, not to compromise any investigations. We don't typically get feedback on the civil side of things, which is the side that I work on. We wouldn't normally get feedback even from within our criminal investigations function within CRA about the progress of a file, if it's been referred to the RCMP and that kind of thing. Those details are quite closely guarded.
Thank you. And then lastly, I'll ask about reporting and the internal structure within the CRA about reporting and whistleblowers. Can you perhaps elaborate on how that system has evolved over the years and how you feel? What are the measures that are being taking place over these years, and how can we better improve that system?
Yeah. I can maybe not talk so much about how it's evolved over time, but in describing it today, I feel quite comfortable with it, to be honest with you, that we do communicate actively with employees, that you can raise concerns that you have with your manager. We say that's probably the first route to take, but then we have an internal process, as I mentioned earlier, which is anonymous. People can have a safe space to raise concerns if they see something happening that they don't think is appropriate. And then finally, there's the overview of the Public Sector Integrity Commissioner, where cases can go there. We have had a few that have gone to the Public Sector Integrity Commissioner, but to my memory, not very many reached there, which could say that our internal systems are working well. But I wouldn't say that with total confidence. But I feel very comfortable that what we have is an open regime that people understand, and hopefully they feel comfortable raising internally in that anonymous framework anything that they see that's going on that's inappropriate.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. Monsieur Vermeer, pour 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to dig deeper on something we were talking about. In its annual report, the Privacy Commissioner refers to only 113 breaches in 2023-2024, but when you look at Radio-Canada's reporting, we're looking at more than 32,000. So I have two questions. What happened and how much money was involved?
So, je vais commencer. Il y a deux parties.
Your question has two parts to it. One has to do with the 2023-24 report and the number that's a lot lower. And unfortunately, we reported these cases just after the deadline for that report, but now we are aware that is one of the reasons of the difference, but Sophie might add additional elements to it. And the second part of your question So we're looking at 31,000 cases, and the total amount of money, if I remember correctly, should be 190 million. If I remember correctly, but if not, my colleagues can correct the number, and it's cumulative from 2022 to that period. Unfortunately, it kept going up, but for the 31,000 cases, I think that's the number. Just to correct one point, there was no deadline, but we were behind. There was some delay because we were focused on protecting the accounts and protecting the citizens, and we were trying to reinforce our systems. But we are now up to date. We have caught up in terms of the numbers in the reports from the Commissioner, and we are working on these cases. And just to clarify also, that of the 190 million mentioned by the Commissioner, the vast majority is from the first year, 2020. So during the pandemic, 180 million dates back to that period. So the agency indicates that, well, rather my question is, why has the CRA not introduced these processes, these additional measures? What I can tell you is that we have been very transparent with Canadians when it comes to the risk. This is not the first time that we're talking about this. It's been years now that we've been educating Canadians. We have our website, and we are leading communication initiatives from the Government of Canada when it comes to frauds. There is a website dedicated to identity theft. It's our website, and it provides information on how people can protect themselves. So there's nothing that we're hiding. But yes, we had a delay in reporting, but we're now up to date. Well, I would need to go back, but if you type fraud, you can find that website. It should be easy to find. But in such cases, often the burden is on the shoulders of the end user. And that's what I'm trying to understand with my question. Without accusing anyone of anything, but you're saying there are resources, we have this, we have that, but if people don't know, and when we talk about digital literacy and financial literacy, maybe the level is not really high, but people still have rights. So to go back to whistleblowers, I've been interested in this topic for a while. When there's a whistleblower, it's because they were not listened to internally, or maybe they were afraid because they were dealing with a superior. So people don't do this out of nothing. People, we assume, are generally honest when they do this. So the culture at the agency seems to be more one that favors secrecy. And I think that there's more of an effort to find out who the whistleblowers were and not who the guilty were. And there is maybe a bit of an impression as to equate whistleblowers with those guilty. So according to me, there isn't a culture of secrecy at the agency. We are acutely aware of the fact that we have a lot of very sensitive information, all information of the taxpayers, and we have to make sure that this information doesn't end up in the hands of people outside the agency. So there is that aspect of things. We work on a need-to-know basis. But I think people at the agency, the vast majority of the people, respect the fact that we have to do things properly. I mean, I do understand that confidentiality is of key importance, but it's not the confidentiality that is necessary to the functioning of the agency. It is vis-a-vis the communication between the agency and citizens and individuals. So there are provincial revenue administrations that they also have the same level of secrecy. So would you say that you have a culture of secrecy or a culture of transparency? I think it's a mix of the two. There are elements of confidentiality and secrecy. It is important and necessary to protect the information.
Quickly, please.
So we report breaches and other situations when there's a scam or a fraud or a conviction. We make that information publicly available because it is a deterrent.
Sorry, Mr. When I cut you off, we were 30 seconds over there. So when I asked you to go short, I need you to go short, please, okay? Because I got to be fair to all the other members, including Mr. Green. Mr. Green, 6 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. And I did, as I suggested, we'll be taking a bit of a different tone with staff. Obviously, with ministers, it's a bit more adversarial. But I am keenly interested on the concept of whistleblowers. And so, Mr. Hamilton, who in your department is responsible for the Public Service Disclosure Protection Act?
The public, that would be the Integrity Commissioner, the act that defines that.
I understand that under the Act, every chief executive in the federal public service must designate a senior officer and establish an internal disclosure mechanism. So who would that be?
In our department, it was Natalie Mayer, I believe.
Okay, and we understand that there are categories of disclosure. You spoke earlier about loyalty, and I think for the average taxpayer, when they hear that, you know, with all the conspiracies about deep state and all these other things, that might become problematic. So I want to take an opportunity to unpack that a little bit. Under what circumstances is it legally allowed for a public sector employee to provide disclosure to the media?
Well, as public servants, we can all do that. We do have spokespersons for the agency. So
Sorry, if there are staff within the agency who are acting as a whistleblower, being defined as a staff who goes public with information, not internally, are there ever instances, in your opinion, that staff from the CRA have the right to disclose to the media publicly in absence of the internal mechanism?
Well, I guess I would differentiate two things. One, sometimes we do speak publicly about not a problem within the agency, but we talk about what's happening, a factual type of technical briefing, so we can have those. But it tends to be controlled, if I can put it that way.
Mr. Hamilton, I want to be direct, and sometimes I don't ask questions in direct ways, maybe. We're talking about, in the context of this, Fifth Estate investigation, where staff have medium level, I don't know which level staff, have disclosed to the media. We're now getting reports that there's an investigation. You suggested, sir, in the previous round of testimony, that can include retaliation up to termination. So I'm asking you, as the commissioner, under what circumstances would it be ethically, legally allowed under the Act to have protected disclosure?
Well, I believe that the Act says you can disclose to the Public Sector Integrity Commissioner. But I'm not a lawyer. I don't have the Act in front of me.
So I'll share with you as a labor guy and the labor critic for our party, looking at PIPSI, that disclosure can be made to the media in cases where there's not sufficient time to follow through on a regular internal process. That it can be to a media, but obviously there needs to be a serious breach of law or an imminent risk of substantial or specific danger to life, health, or safety of persons in the environment. Of course, they would want to get internal union advice on that, but the point we're trying to make here is that from time to time, when there are systems failures that are not about disclosing individual cases or disaggregated information about privacy matters of individual citizens, but rather aggregated cases of systemic failures, would you not agree that there are, under some instances, an ethical rationale for going public?
I suppose in theory there could be something where you've exhausted all of your opportunities.
Now, I'll give you one other example where their disclosure would be protected, because I asked you earlier, and I'll let you close with the question that I asked you at the end, which the question was, for your memory, what do you have to say to those people who might be feeling like They're being investigated now for being whistleblowers to the media, and, as you testified, could be facing termination. I want to put to you, there's another example where they could be protected, and that is in the instance of a public parliamentary hearing. So, in theory, I could invite publicly to all the whistleblowers to make anonymous submissions to this committee, which, in theory, based on my reading, although I'm not a lawyer, they would probably want to talk to their union, could protect them under the Act. Would you agree that that's a possibility here, given the parliamentary privileges extended by Parliament?
Yeah, I don't have a particular comment on the parliamentary privilege and what's in or out. What I would say, and what would I say to our employees, is if you think you see something that's going wrong in the agency that you want to talk about, I would point them to those avenues that we have, which the three that I've mentioned. And if you get frustrated on that, I would like somebody to come and talk to me.
And in the event they don't, what's the consequence?
In the event they don't what?
In the event that they don't go through the internal process and they go public to the media, now they're under investigation, what's the consequence?
Well, that would depend on what the action was, right? Because it could be relatively minor, it could be major, it could be disclosing taxpayer information, it could be something like talking about things that
talking to the Fifth Estate about major privacy breaches to the tune of 31,000 different files. What would that hypothetically look like in terms of retaliation within the Whistleblower Act?
Well, but again, it's not so much related to, is it 31,000 files? It's really, what was the action that was taken by the employee? How serious was that of a violation of something? And we would
I'm out of time. I did commit to you. I give you the opportunity to answer. That's the 6 minutes that I have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Green. 5-minute round. Mr. Chambers, go ahead.
I know my colleague, Mr. Green, is not a lawyer, but he plays a good one on TV sometimes. I just, Mrs. Glarneau, I just want to, I'm just a little confused just about timeline. Is it that the agency was unaware of the totality of the privacy breaches when you were working through the backlog, or did you know the number and you chose not to report it?
So first of all, I want to say that there was no nefarious intent here to hide any information, nor was there an intention to delay any kind of reporting. I think that's an important
I understand.
piece
So the question is, were you aware, like, it's one thing to not know that there was 31,000, but another to be aware that there's 31,000 and not report? Okay, Mr. Lemieux.
So we were aware that we had thousands of those cases. It was reported in the OEG report. At that time, the report was saying that in July of 2022, we had 23,000 of them for $131 million, which information we gave to the OEG that was in the report. I came to committee in February, and I said that we were at 26,000 at that time. And we were continuing to find those cases because it takes a long time. We have to validate everything. Our intent was to report on those, but our priority was to deal with these. And it was never our intention not to disclose those. We had to find a mechanism to do it. And what I can assure you is that we reported on all of those.
My time is very limited. I understand it's not your intention, but the result was that there was a miscommunication or a lack of communication between the CRA and the Privacy Commissioner. Was that a fair assessment then?
I don't know to which extent the Commissioner was not aware when those breaches were reported by the OEG.
I'd like to move on. With respect to the fraud, the GST schemes, the carousel schemes, when did the CRA first learn that this was a serious issue? Like what year? Not a date, but what year? Are we going back a couple years? Is it just the last year? When did these schemes really become on your radar?
Yeah, I mean, the carousel schemes within the GST have been known in the GST community internationally.
Okay.
For a number of years. The severity of it, I'm not sure when it became.
Okay, I guess my question is, has the CRA made in previous years, have you made any recommendations to the Finance Department to enact legislative changes to help prevent these schemes?
We do two
Point
things.
of order, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead on your point of order.
Thanks, Chair. I do understand that you are very lenient, but I think that the tighter we can keep it, the better it is for this specific issue, and I would question relevance on this question.
Go ahead.
GST carousel schemes are fraud. We're talking about fraud today. So the question is, has the CRA made recommendations for legislative change to help combat these schemes? Have you spoken to the Finance Department about this?
I can say that we have had discussions with our finance colleagues about this, because there are things that are done in other jurisdictions, but we also take responsibility ourselves.
But we haven't. There has been no legislative fix for this, and we've known about it for multiple years.
There has not been a legislative change.
Okay.
What we have been doing is on the administrative side, trying to get in earlier to capture.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. In my final minute, just back on these write-offs, which may be a result of fraud. Some of them are a result of fraud. A significant increase in the amount of corporate write-offs, $4.9 billion in 1 year. You've previously disclosed the amounts. We've talked about that today in terms of the largest amounts. Do you think, as a matter of public interest, that Section 241, we ought to consider amending 241 to make public the names of corporations that receive very large tax write-offs that owe the Canadian public money?
So I don't have a view on that I would express. The Section 241 is in the law. That's a Ministry of Finance responsibility.
Right, but I mean, these spikes, these write-offs now are getting to serious levels. 11 corporate taxpayers wrote off over $1 billion. We don't know who those corporations are. As a matter of public interest, now that we're talking about real money, don't you think that the public should know who these corporations are?
Need a quick response, please. Quick.
Yeah, and again, I don't really have a comment on that. We do our best to be as transparent as we can with what we have. If you'd like, in a later questioning, perhaps Mark could outline a little bit more about the write-off process, but we concentrate on having a robust process to try to get debts collected.
Thank you. Ms. Shanahan for 5, go ahead.
Well, thank you, Chair. And I want to come back to the 31,000 cases and how that number evolved, because I was there at the Public Accounts Committee. I don't remember specifically how everyone testified, but I remember that the real crux of the matter was that, why did we have that sudden huge number of identity fraud cases emerging, obviously out of a very difficult time, COVID, and the fact that there was decisions made around doing a post-verification rather than a pre-verification. And that was, of course, to make sure that Canadians had the money they needed to survive the lockdowns that we all needed to have to protect public health. So, but I can understand that put a huge pressure on the system. And I know that in my own riding, we came across cases where there was clearly identity theft and money was, bogus bank accounts were opened up, and because we're a small community, the banks were actually pretty good at recognizing the cases, and they froze the accounts so that there were constituents who had not applied for COVID that had COVID money in an account in their name, and that account was frozen. So it was very interesting to see that there was the ability, there was some sight where possible on the fact that, because I think the banks are very good at this when they recognize unusual activity in account opening of accounts and use of accounts and so on, and certainly any rapid closure of accounts, taking out all the money and taking it out. I just looked for fun because we all get notices from the CRA, and I just looked because someone was concerned about, well, the onus is on the taxpayer to go and check their CRA account. I certainly recommend it to people, and I think as the apps become more user-friendly and so on, it's easier to do. But just putting in CRA, I've got a bunch of messages from the CRA over the last, year and a half or whatever, that I have new mail. I should check it. I should take a look and see what it is. And I appreciate that kind of service. Now, maybe someone can give me a hint. Or is there anything I should be looking for that it would be a bogus message? Because we certainly have seen that kind of thing, and my constituents are very concerned about, fraud texts and so on that they receive that are clearly fraud.
Go ahead. Yes. So it's quite possible that some people will call saying that they are the agency. And I would say if you have a doubt, it's better not to divulge any information to those callers. If it happens, because sometimes we have to call the taxpayers when we have identity theft, this is one of the exceptions where we would call someone. If you don't feel good about that, if you have any doubts, don't take the call. Tell the person that you don't believe it's CRA. If it's CRA, the person will explain to you what are the steps to validate that they are calling from the CRA. They will give you a number. They will ask you to go on the website to find yourself the 1-800 number that you should be calling. And from there, someone will confirm to you that someone at CRA is trying to call you, and they could put you in contact with that person. We have an identity protection service in the agency. There is a specific line for those cases. If you call the general inquiry line, when you listen to the message, you could press one number and they will direct your call to the identity protection services. The wait call there is quite short and people will take care of your call. So in doubt, call the agency. We are there and we will be able to see if really someone from the agency is trying to reach you.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. Lemire, because I've instructed my mother that anybody who's calling, asking her anything, she's to hang up that phone. Do not answer. And she actually thwarted one of those grandparent schemes by that, and so what a tremendous relief.
Thank you.
I would add that if you don't want to talk to someone from CRA, they will send you a paper letter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Ms. Shannon. I always love those calls from the magistrate, the local magistrate that says that your tax account has been seized or whatever bullshit they give you. Monsieur Villemire, 2 minutes et demie, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je souris toujours quand j'entends l'Agence de revenu me dire que
Thank you, Chair. It's always a pleasure to hear from the CRA that the wait time is short. I would like to move a motion, Chair, and the text is the following. Whereas on November 6, 2024, the Liberal government announced the closure of the Canadian subsidiary of the social network TikTok, that the committee invite to testify A, for 2 hours, François-Philippe Champagne, Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry, B, for 1 hour each, David Vigneault, former Director of CSIS, and to Philippe Dufresne, Privacy Commissioner of Canada, that the committee report its observations and conclusions to the House of Commons. Okay, thank you, Mr. Villemire. The motion is in order. I just want to let the witnesses know, please remain in your seats for a second. We are going to go ahead and debate the motion. Do you have anything to say on that, Mr. Villemire? Well, recently we read in newspapers that the Minister of Innovation had initiated an investigation on TikTok, and we had the representative here at the committee, and we asked them questions, and we asked them whether the investigation had been completed, and it was recently completed. So the minister has issued a statement saying that the government has now banned TikTok in Canada, but Canadians can continue to use TikTok. It's a personal choice, but it's a bit of a paradox in my opinion. And there is, however, an aspect that is not illuminated at all. If TikTok is not in Canada, the commissioner will not be able to play an oversight role, because I believe that this motion is really within the realm of this committee, if you will. So I would like the committee to entertain this motion. Thank you. I have Mr. Caputo and then Ms. Shanahan.
Mr. Chair, I believe this would be considered a friendly amendment, which is just to add to Mr. Villeneuve's motion that such would occur prior to us breaking on December 17th, 2024.
Okay, we'll have to work that out. We'll try to get it in if we can. I don't know if we're going to add that to the motion because we've got a schedule ahead of us. Go ahead, Ms. Shanahan.
Thank you, Chair. And en fait, je vais procéder en français parce que.
I'll do this in French. I fully understand the rationale from Mr. Villeneuve. A decision such as this one is a big decision, of course. And I would advise all Canadians against having TikTok accounts. It's a Chinese company, and honestly, it's just common sense not to use it. We have very creative and capable people, and young people love TikTok. But I think that there is already a sufficient number of apps and platforms of sharing content and the like. All the craziness that you can find on these platforms these days. But unfortunately, it's a method of collecting information and data on Canadians. It's unbelievable. We, of course, talk about confidentiality. Mr. Chair, I am wondering whether we need the witnesses with us, because I can see that you're also thinking the same thing. Well, I think we can take care of this motion rather quickly. Well, I have a couple of points to make, and we are running out of our allotted time. That's why. So I have a couple of points to make. And we're trying to protect people's privacy, their personal information on the one hand, but on the other, people are interested in these kinds of apps and platforms, and you end up putting in your personal information, not necessarily financial information, but personal information nonetheless, such as your name, your address, your contact information, what sorts of activities you're into, and your friend circles, etc. So I will be the first person to say and defend that all of these activities should be protected.
Yeah. Point of order? I got a point of order from Mr. Green there. Go ahead.
Mr. Chair, I'm just wondering what the speakers list is, because given the time, I wouldn't want to subject these fine folks, our public servants, to what is likely to be a lengthy debate. And I'm, just reflecting on the fact that...
Are we expecting a lengthy debate on this?
No? What is the speakers list?
Okay, so we've got roughly till around 6 o'clock or so. I've got Ms. Khalid following Ms. Shanahan. I actually have a question of Mr. Hamilton that I'd like to ask, but at the end of it. But
okay, fair enough. We'll wait till 6.
That's where we're at. Go ahead, Ms. Shanahan.
So, juste le point que c'est très important.
So I just want to make the point that all this information should be protected. And when the news broke, that was a question I had. So we are banning the company. They will no longer have offices in Canada. but Canadians will be able to keep using the platform. So when I heard that, I just said, hold on a second, because what means will we have to protect Canadians in their use of this platform? Maybe their information is going to be shared in unethical ways. When we look at the legislation, PAPIDA, and the instances and the responsibilities that they have, the Privacy Commissioner, for instance, they have a supervisory duty. And they can rectify situations and take action against TikTok if there are breaches, regardless of where the servers are located. And apparently they have locations in Singapore and elsewhere, and these are countries with which we have agreements and good relations. So I was reassured to hear that. Well, it also puts us in a difficult situation, Mr. Chair, because we have current and past members of the committee. I don't know about that side. But in any case, members who sat on the Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians and they were able to see classified information during their time there, and there were similar discussions over there at that committee too, and it was a question of national security, and that was clear, and that part of it was also public. There is also classified information. And it's very strict, if not stricter than what people working for the CRA accept. That is to say, that kind of information cannot be disclosed publicly as far as it has to do with national security. So I understand the motion. I understand the concerns of my colleague because I had the same concerns. Will Canadians and Quebecers be protected even though TikTok is now banned and they will now no longer have offices in Canada? And the answer is yes, they are protected. There might be another question, and I will not even venture down that route in order not to bring questions of national security and intelligence before this committee, and because there's a more appropriate venue for that. So I think I will leave it at that. I hope that my colleague understands that it comes from a good place. We have already done a study on TikTok and other platforms because we all share the same concerns. We all want to know what powers we have as a government, or what powers do law enforcement agencies have through our legal system to supervise or look into potential abuses with regard to the information of Canadian citizens. That was my argument. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry. Was reading something. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to Monsieur Villiers for moving this motion. As I'm sure all committee members, well, the permanent ones on here anyway, know how I feel about the issue of social media companies and how they operate with respect to protection of Canadians, with respect to privacy of Canadians. So in principle, I think this is a good study for our government and for parliamentarians to partake in. However, I'm not sure if this committee is the right place for this, and I'll make two very quick points on that. The first is that with the ICA, the decision that's come out from the Investment Canada Act on this, I think that the RCMP commissioner and the minister would be really limited in what they're able to say, given security clearance challenges and the issue of national security and intelligence in general that surrounds this entire issue. As my colleague Brenda Shanahan had said, when we're talking about China and the whole reason why this company is under investigation in the first place, I would think that the National Security Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians would be a better place to house this, where there would be more ability for the RCMP, for the minister to be more open and to be able to talk with full honesty and full paperwork on the table to say that this is what needs to happen, or that this is the circumstances surrounding the decision. The second point that I would make on this, Chair, is that I know that Mr. Villiers spoke about this, about PIPEDA and its jurisdiction. Now, I think that TikTok would still be subject to the Canadian privacy laws in Canada, regardless of where they operate, as long as there's that touch point for Canadians. So I'm not sure if that's accurate. That once they leave the country, that they would no longer be under Canadian jurisdiction, because there are a lot of companies that operate in Canada that don't have headquarters in Canada that are still bound by Canadian laws. And in this case, I think TikTok would definitely be bound by PIPEDA in the way that it operates in Canada, whether or not its office is located on Canadian soil or not. So those are the two quick points that I just wanted to make, Chair, and I realize that we are going a little bit over time. I just wanted to make a very quick amendment to the motion before we go to a vote. Now, the motion, it asks for Minister François-Philippe Champagne to appear. No problem with that. Part B of the motion, for 1 hour each, we're asking David Vigneault, who's the former director of CSIS, to appear, and Philippe Dufresne, who's the privacy commissioner. I think that the former director of CSIS does not have a role to play in any of this. I think that it should be the current director of CSIS if we are going to invite them. That would be Mr. Rogers, Mr. Daniel Rogers, to appear. So I would move the amendment that we replace Mr. David Vigneault, former director of CSIS, with Mr. David Rogers, the current director of CSIS.
Amendment, if I understand it correctly, to replace David Vigneault with David Rogers. That's it.
The delete former.
Well, you mentioned Philippe Dufresne too in there, so I just want to.
Well,
make sure.
I was just reading out the motion. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm going to go to Monsieur Villiers sur l'amendement, s'il vous plaît.
We'll go to Mr. Villiers on the amendment, please. Yes, I'd like to thank my colleague for their cooperation, and this made me think of something. It might be a good idea to invite David Vigneault, and the new director of CSIS together.
Madame Khalid.
Ms. Khalid?
Je disais.
I was saying that I really like your idea, and maybe it might be a good idea that to invite David Vigneault and a new director so that there is no gap between the testimonies, because the new director was not there when the investigation was going on. So both directors of CSIS, I'd be comfortable with that.
Is that a sub-amendment then, Chair?
Madame Khalid.
Ms. Khalid moved an amendment to replace Mr. Vigneault with Mr. Rogers. So if you want to move a sub-amendment, yes. Okay.
Okay. So basically, it's to add Mr. Vigneault back, René. C'est ça?
Avoir les deux.
Avoir les deux. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to accept that as a sub-amendment to accept the two of them. Ms. Shanahan, go ahead.
J'aimerais savoir
I just want to know why we're inviting the former director, because people can change roles, but they cannot disclose everything they did when they were in that post. The same regulations, the same laws, the same legislation, and the same restrictions will apply. Honestly, it's just repetition. It's redundant. That's why the two will be able to complement each other. We won't have a time gap in the narrative, if you will. That's the logic. But the decisions have just been made, and Mr. Rogers have been imposed for a while now. Well, I don't know who was in post when. I have a sub-amendment from Mr. Villemure to invite both Mr. Vigneault and Mr. Rogers. That's the sub-amendment that's before us.
Then Ms. Khalid, go ahead. On the sub-amendment, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I'd like you to consider ruling the sub-amendment out of order because it goes against the core reason of the amendment. The core reason of the amendment is to delete the gentleman's name. You can't have a sub-amendment that would then add it back. So I would ask you, perhaps, Mr. Chair, to reconsider. I don't think it's in order.
I'm gonna accept it, Mr. Housefather. I mean, if it's up to the committee that they don't want that to occur, then they can certainly vote against it if they choose to. So I'm going to accept both of them together. I think it's a reasonable proposal that Mr. Villemure has put forward. So
Point of order.
What have I got now?
All right, I'm just going to go back to my original. While it was nice in theory, they said they were going to be short. Clearly, that's not the case.
Yeah.
We have staff, that have, like senior level management that's sitting here.
I do appreciate that.
And so what I would propose to you, Mr. Chair, is that if it is amenable to the witnesses, that we be given the opportunity to provide, this is coming from somebody who lost their round of questions, by the way, but we be given the opportunity to provide them with questions in writing that they could respond to.
Fair enough.
Because this is an unforeseeable future.
Yeah, so I'm going to accept that, Mr. Green. I'm going to dismiss the witnesses. I have a question, Mr. Hamilton, that I will be sending through to the clerk on behalf of the committee as well. So that I would like that responded to, and it's in relation to the CERB fraud. And I know that you've done investigations within the CRA. I want to make sure I want an answer as to what other investigations in what other departments have been done. That will be my question to you, sir, when I'm able to do that in writing. Okay, anyways, and then so now I've got on the sub amendment. I've got Ms. Khalid. Go ahead, and I have asked for more resources too. Okay, go ahead.
Thanks very much, Chair. You know what? I think I've made my points, and I will just add, in addition, just with respect to the ICA, I realized that I didn't clarify for anybody that was listening that the ICA refers to Investment Canada Act, and that the reason why I said that it would be a limited study was because it has a certain classification with respect to its clearance level. So the ICA is a specific classification of a document, and members of parliament, like, well, I mean, I do have my top secret security clearance. So
Others don't,
but
though.
others don't,
No.
and so I don't think that this is something that should be public with respect to any review or any discussion around those documents. So with that, I'll stop there, and then again reiterate my points that that it is any current director of CSIS should be able to talk about anything that has happened in this history, and I don't think we need to bring in any former directors. I think the job would be done with the current director. It just doesn't make sense to bring somebody back. I'll park my comments there. Chair, thanks, Chair.
I've got on the sub-amendment still. We've got the sub-amendment on the floor. That's what we're discussing. So I'm going to look for unanimous consent. I've got no other speakers on the sub-amendment. Do I have unanimous consent on the sub-amendment? Okay, so on division? Oh, okay. So we're going to go to a vote on the sub-amendment. I'm going to ask the clerk to take the vote.
Did you see on division?
Well, I thought I heard on division. I heard on division. Who said on division?
Vote.
Did you say on division, though?
No, I'm asking for a recorded vote.
I'm asking you, did you say on division? That's what I'm asking you.
Yeah.
Did you? Yes.
In error, I said on division.
In error, okay. That's fine. Let's go to a recorded vote.
So the vote is on the sub-amendment moved by Mr. Vilmer to the amendment moved by Ms. Khalid. Mr. Baines.
No.
Mr. Maloney.
No.
Mr. Hausfather.
No.
Ms. Khalid. Ms. Shanahan.
No.
Mr. Barrett.
Yes.
Mr. Soroka.
Yes.
Mr. Chambers. Monsieur Villemur. Mr. Green.
Je vote pour la motion.
Yeas 5, yeas 5, nays 5.
Okay, I'm going to vote in favor of it as well. So that means that the sub-amendment will pass. So I'm going to go straight to the motion as amended with the amendment. So the amendment now includes Mr. Vigneault and Mr. Rogers, which means on the amendment, do I have consensus on the amendment? Recorded division. Okay, thank you. Madam Clerk?
The vote is on the amendment as amended. Mr. Baines.
Yes.
Mr. Maloney.
Yes.
Mr. Hausfather.
Yes.
Ms. Khalid. Ms. Shanahan.
So we're on the, just so that we're clear, we're on the amendment, right? The amendment, which includes Mr. Vigneault and Mr. Rogers. That's where we're at right now, because that was approved in the sub-amendment. Okay? So that's where we're at. So if you're voting yes, you're voting for Mr. Rogers and Mr. Vigneault to come. And if you're voting no, then you're voting against the amendment as amended. Okay? That's where we're at.
Thank you for the clarity.
Back to the vote, Mr. Barrett.
Yes.
Mr. Soroka.
Yes.
Mr. Chambers. Monsieur Villemur.
Oui.
Mr. Green.
Oui.
Yeas 10. Oui 10.
So the amendment passes. Now we are on the main motion as amended. I have no speakers, so I'm going to call the vote. Madam Clerk, I suspect that we want a recorded vote? Okay, go ahead.
The vote is on the motion by Mr. Vilmer as amended. Mr. Baines.
Yes.
Mr. Maloney.
Yes.
Mr. Hausfather.
Yes.
Ms. Khalid. Ms. Shanahan. Mr. Bratt.
Yes.
Mr. Soroka.
Yes.
Mr. Chambers. Monsieur Villemur. Mr. Green. Yeas 10 pour 10.
Okay, so the motion as amended passes. I have no other business for the committee. I am going to adjourn the meeting. Have a great weekend. Thank you, everyone.